Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Tim Welter, a senior research fellow here at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for joining us for the public kickoff of the Institute's Global Competition Project. To start, let me offer a hypothesis, for the United States to continue to thrive as a global leader, economically and otherwise. A societal level understanding and approach to competition must be invigorated. The Global Competition Project was launched to explore that hypothesis and more by commissioning a spectrum of experts from diverse fields across the Potomac Institute's network to identify and elevate issues and insights as to the primary challenges and opportunities associated with societal level competitions in our epoch. What are the greatest vulnerabilities to consider? What's at stake? The project's goal is to develop foundational references through research, discussion, events like today, and papers that we'll be writing for national security professionals, policymakers, industry leaders, and others as they drive awareness and understanding in how the U.S. might address the most consequential aspects of near-peer competition. Before we get to today's discussion, I would like to offer the floor to the chairman of the Potomac Institute, General Al Gray, for some introductory remarks.
You already used up my time. I want to welcome all of you and appreciate you coming. Thank you very much. We all know a very, very important topic. Let's get on with it. Listen to what the experts have to say. Jen, you got any comments?
I do. I just want to welcome everyone. Potomac Institute, we're an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank here in the DC area, and we focus on science and technology policy issues at the intersection of business and government. And so when we were talking about this global competition project, it wasn't just about government and national security implications, and typically that is a defense discussion. But global competition is much more broad and at that intersection of business and government and how they interact. And so as we talk about this today in terms of competition and defining competition, we did want to make sure that we were addressing what that means for US industry as well, and how that should be playing as part of the national security discussion. So Tim, over to you and to our experts.
Thank you. And that was Dr. Jen Buss, our CEO here at the Institute. So now I'd like to move on to introduce our panel for today and introduce the discussion. First of all, I'm very happy to introduce the Honorable Al Schaefer, former Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment and a member of the Potomac Institute's Board of Regents. The Secretary will facilitate our discussion today on defining competition and whether the U.S. is in a position to lead the world in several key areas moving forward. Secretary Schaefer is joined today by our distinguished panelists who we're very lucky and honored to have with us. Dr. Melissa Flagg, founder of Flagg Consulting, LLC, and former senior fellow and adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Dr. Jamie Durnan, assistant to the Director for Strategic Initiatives at MIT Lincoln Labs and chairman and co-founder of the Andrew W. Marshall Foundation. And Dr. Lori John Domenico, Vice President and Chief Acceleration Officer at MITRE. Secretary Schaefer will start by providing highlights from a paper he wrote, which is one in a series to be produced for the project. Constructive reactions, critiques, questions from our discussion today will be considered for integration into the final version of his paper to be published by the Institute at a later date. Ultimately, again, these papers are to be drawn upon as a reference for policymakers, industry leaders, and others, and how the country might address the most consequential aspects of societal level competition in the future. Mr. Secretary, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Tim. And I do want to do one short cleanup. It's Dr. Gian Domenico, and she is actually the CEO of MITRE Ingenuity, which is something that has been stood up by MITRE Corporation to try to bridge the gap and get more technologies out into commercial industry more quickly. So she's actually doing some of the things that a lot of people in Washington say we have to do. So I just wanted to highlight that. I have just a couple of comments at the beginning, and the way we're going to operate this today, each of the panelists are going to make a few comments, and then we're going to go into a moderated discussion with questions. Over the past several years, the phrase great power competition has emerged in national security literature. And in fact, as recently as January 2020, Deputy Secretary Kath Hicks held a panel at CSIS to discuss what GPC is. And I think that we as a nation need to go back and really rethink the parameters of great power competition. Broadly, it may be thought of as a competition amongst nations over ideology. And since it's national security, it involves political, economic, military, and technological competition. Currently, most writers are framing GPC as a tension between the US, Russia, and China. I'm not sure that that's right. And part of what I want to get into today is it just about countries or is it about alliances? Too often as Americans, we look at competition as a win-lose proposition, and Americans do not like to lose. You hear people in the literature say, how can America be competitive with everybody? How can we compete? I'm not sure that it matters that we, the US, are better than anybody else. I think we have to try to define what great powers competition is. We should think about great powers competition as the US versus other nations, or the US and allies versus other nations. And it leads to a question. Is US security enhanced with strong partnership with other liberal nations? When I think about great power competition, I don't believe the right question is win or lose. It's how do we position the US and what are the key things that we have to pay attention to so the people of the United States and our allies are not disadvantaged compared to other nations. The places I'm concerned about are economic, militarily, and technologically. Economically, we're not in a good place, I do not believe. In fact, as my good friend, the Honorable John Young likes to say, we are living beyond our means. The current national debt is 28.2 trillion, about 226,000 for every taxpayer. The debt to GDP ratio is the largest in history. And in either 2023 or 2024, the nation will pay more to service the debt than we will pay for defense of the nation. Further, the share of federal budget that is mandatory spending has risen from 25% in '62 to about 67% today. We see continued supply chain fragility coming out of the pandemic, and we have one of the worst in the United States income inequalities in the world. Frankly, we're in a bad place in our economic posture, and if we don't shore that up, great power competition will become somewhat irrelevant. I also think we're not in a great place for defense. For a number of very good reasons, most notably the Cold War and then the war on terrorism, we have fundamentally deferred fielding replacements for about 30 years. We've had some systems come in, but now we have a huge bow wave of new systems that right now we can't afford. When you look at nuclear modernization, that's $1.2 trillion. When you look at full rate production of the JSF, that's another large chunk of money. US still spends more on platforms than combat enablers like cyber, EW, and open systems. So right now we have a pipeline of systems and platforms in the pipeline that we really can't afford. Mackenzie Eglin at the American Enterprise Institute figured that we would have to have a 5% real growth in the budget for the next decade to be able to afford the platforms in the pipeline. I believe that the nation really does need to do a bottoms-up review of what capabilities the US needs to have as we move forward. And then finally, in technology space, the US used to be a world leader in technology, but we are increasingly being challenged in the technological arena. The amount the US is spending on research and development as a percent of GDP has fallen from 2% about 30 years ago to 7.7% today. More importantly, China and Asia more broadly continue to emphasize R&D. Premier Xi has made S&T modernization one of the pillars of the People's Republic of China. So does it matter? And is it important the U.S. is competitive technologically? I don't have all the answers, but I do believe we have to reduce the debt while modernizing the military smartly based upon what capabilities we need. And we have to think about how do we want to play in a world that's becoming increasingly an advanced technology world. So those are my opening comments to try to frame up the problem. And from this, I want to have a discussion what really matters when we think about great powers competition to America, to our people, and what does competition mean? So with that, I will stop and turn it over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. Melissa Flagg. Melissa used to be the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Research, Senior Fellow at Georgetown, an adjunct professor at Georgetown, and a very, very deep thinker on what does it mean for technological balance and STEM education. So Melissa, over to you.
Thanks, Al. And thank you all at PIPS for inviting me to be here today. This is one of my favorite topics because I feel like one of our biggest challenges in this conversation around competition is that we're stuck in a 1960 world. And the landscape has changed, and we have a really difficult time kind of shifting our structures and our organizations and our mindsets and our emotional attachment to the leadership that we enjoyed in that period to meet a fundamentally altered landscape. So let's just talk briefly about that. In 1960, the United States was about 69% of global R&D. We were 69% of global R&D because the world had been decimated. The world leaders, I mean, chemistry was written in German before World War II, right? And so it wasn't that we were always the best. It was that we saw a moment and we had some really enlightened leadership that allowed us to rise in a vacuum and to hold on to that lead for a long period of time. During this period, the federal government was also roughly, interestingly, almost the same fraction of American R&D. So the federal government was the single central player. At about 69% of American R&D was federally funded or performed. And so we had this period where we created all of our organizations. Every single science funding agency that we have today was created in this period. The Department of Defense was a huge player in actually funding science in this period as well. And so much of our high-tech industry in this period was born out of this relationship with the US military. And so we have this very tight relationship between science, the federal government in general, the US military specifically, and the rest of the world. If you fast forward to around 2000, between 2000 and today, the world looked at the United States and said, you know, that technology thing, there's something to that. And they didn't do it for their militaries. They did it for their economy. And we see global R&D triple between 2000 and now, going from around 890 billion annually in 2000 to well over 2.2 trillion, and by some estimates around 2.4 trillion annually today. Of that, about a quarter of that is the United States. It's not because we're falling behind, it's because everybody else ramped it up, right? We still have a rising investment as a nation in R&D. And China's about a quarter of that. Guess what? There's about 1.1 trillion annually being invested by the rest of the world, right? More than we had total investment in 2000 is now being invested not by the US or China, but by the rest of the world. So I want to think about that as we talk later in questions about, again, this idea that Al Schaefer brought up about alliances. If we frame competition as a bipolar engagement between the US and China, we've lost already. This is just not the reality of the world today. There is not a singular global hegemon across these spaces. And that is going to make us really challenge this Cold War structure and mentality and ideologies that we all sort of grew up with and is our lived experience. So now I think another thing I want to pull out of that is the federal government is also no longer the central funder in the United States. The federal government is now less than 22% of American R&D, and actually less than 10% of performed R&D. So not only is industry a huge player, and we'll hear more about that later, I believe, from Lori, but also trend lines for philanthropy, for academic endowments, these are all going up, and the federal government's role is basically flat. They are still a critical player for setting a lot of our standards and our incentives and our cultural norms, especially in the educational system coming out of academia. But these things are reducing. Even in basic science, the federal government funds less than 50% of American basic science. This is really hard for people to wrap their heads around. And so when we think about alliances in competition, these are not just alliances with our international friends. These are domestic alliances. And this is about more than just shouting at people about patriotism or profits. There is a space in between. It's like a hollow triangle that we've created of power, profits, and prestige. But in the middle, there are all of these problems that need to get solved that really nobody's focusing on. And this again pulls on this thread that was mentioned in the introduction as well around inequality. If you want to have a societal level competition, you have to really know what society wants out of that competition. And your competition has to serve your society, not just your military and the top 1% that the stock market represents, right? It has to serve the citizens of the nation, and they need to feel invested in this as a competition that has a metric at the end for winning that is valuable to them. So I would argue that so much of what we need to begin to think about is how do we leverage industry? How do we leverage states and localities that provide so much of our education and our services to citizens that are so important to them on a day-to-day basis? How do we think about the role that philanthropy plays if we actually begin to pull together domestic alliances to bring our full capability to bear? And I know that we're coming to an end here, so I'm going to wrap up, but I am going to say, I don't think anyone would ever say, I'm going to go to war with 22% of my army, right? But right now, the way our alliances and our mindset is structured, we are going to war with 22% of our technological capability. It is only if we fund it that we believe we can leverage it. And we need a competition that really does draw on what is America at our best. And America at our best is bottom up. It's not trying to autocrat China, right? It's messy and it's a little chaotic and it's competitive, and it draws on a philanthropic culture that no other nation on earth has to bring our citizens' best strengths to bear on their well-being. And yet at the federal level now, it almost feels like we pit the states against each other. We pit every company against each other because it's fair. And yet it keeps us from actually lifting up the capability of our country and pointing it in a direction towards an outcome of a competition that everyone wants. I have not heard a single person in the policy, international affairs, national security space in Washington give me a message and an outcome of a competition that makes me believe this is valuable to me as a citizen. I hear things that are important for the wealthiest large companies, and I hear things that are important for the military, which is now 50% of my discretionary funding. But I don't hear things that say your life will be better And this is why, and this is the role that you can play in a societal competition. If we really want to bring people together, there has to be a reason, and it has to be well articulated. And I think we've really lost sight of redefining a competition and what it means and what winning means in a fundamentally new era where dominance and quote unquote singular leadership, we simply cannot spend our way back to 1960 where those things existed. And we've got to redefine winning in a fundamentally multipolar world, and most especially in the aspects of technology and the economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. You gave us a lot to think about. I will come back to you with some questions. But next we go to Jamie Dernan. Jamie has a very long and distinguished career. He's a naval officer. He was in the think tank for the CNO. Then he became Secretary Rumsfeld's chief of staff. Has moved on to Lincoln Laboratory, where he is responsible for their strategic initiatives. But most importantly, he was mentored by Andy Marshall, and Andy always said, you need to take time to think about what problem you're trying to solve. And Jamie has beaten that into me. So Jamie, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Al, and thank you to the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies for inviting me here today. And also, I want to thank you for making me a doctor, but I think I'd rather be a medical doctor, but I'm not a doctor, and I'm leaving that title for my kids because they're a heck of a lot smarter than me. So a couple of things to start, excuse me, based on Al, your opening comments is, you actually talked about great powers competition, which is, I believe, the right way to look at this. We keep talking about great power competition, which suggests what we always do, which is look at one particular enemy or one particular country and say, that's the competition. And I'll get into that in a little bit. And also Melissa's is very, very right when we talk about national security. And again, folks tend to think about national security as a defense issue, as a military issue. And we're talking about societal whole of country. And that's very important to understand. So there were a couple of questions that we were asked to think about. And one was whether our competitive advantage is coming to an end, or has it ended, and what does it mean to be competitive? But I have to tell you that given the questions and the rest of the panels, I'm probably a better person to be on the listening side. So I'm going to try to keep my remarks more big picture, a bit orthogonal, and you and I will be much more interested in learning from Melissa, Laurie, and Al than me. So let me just start. Oh, I've got an administrative note. Sorry, it's just taking time, because I always seem to say things dumb or perhaps a little irreverent. My comments are mine alone. They don't represent those of any of my friends, enemies, employers, or any of those others that I may have missed. So with that, I got to agree that the future of the competition is a very important topic that I don't believe we as a nation are serious about. Yeah, so we do need to have the societal level debate. And that's why I believe that this session is the first salvo in providing an instructive foundation that will continue to get us not just to think about the future, but also to understand what our goals and our objectives are as a nation for the future and how we might achieve those goals. We also need to be constantly vigilant in understanding that our future comparative and competitive position is not just all about us. This is not the 1950s. Melissa said the 1960s. I agree with her there. I could say the 1950s, 60s, 70s. You get it. And where we dominated, along with our allies, global GDP, the means of production, and frankly, prosperity around the world. We need to ask and understand how the rest of the world is changing and how this impacts our definition of competition and what strategic directions we might pursue. We've got to look at these reconfigurations that are occurring right under our noses but we're not going to see them for 10, 20, 30 years. We know how to do this. We just don't seem to want to do this because it's really not, because it's really hard. We need to be more serious about looking back at the case studies, because there's a lot that's been written. There are case studies, and we need to conduct these in integrative analyses of the case studies to identify and understand the trends that have gotten us where we are, and finally the rest of the world to where it is today. The case studies have to be broad, and they have to be interdisciplinary, and we can't focus only on what I call the traditional cases of military, political, and economic projections. We've got to expand the case studies to include the areas such as decision-making under stress, management, bureaucracies, generational differences, science, as Melissa has pointed out, engineering, technology, innovation, ideology, and the list just goes on, but that list has got to be taken into account, and we need to build the analytical tools that can provide insight into the interdisciplinary analysis of the trends that we see, and how those trends might provide a basis for understanding the complex processes by which human beings compete. I mean, these can't be linear trends. We have to look at all this orthogonally. This is really important because we need to raise the issues, what I call the non-traditionals, as to address in developing a strategy. And we need that strategy that's going to guide and inform the decisions and investments necessary for us as a nation to not just compete, but to lead the future. And that's where we were good at that once. We should be good at it again. Now, what that means leading is probably not as dominant as we necessarily might have been in 1945. But also the strategy that was written in 1945 was actually pretty good. It was focused on how you deal with the hard problem at that point, which was the Soviet Union. And it wasn't something that was written and then stuck in a vault or discussed in the newspapers, and then nobody paid attention to it for 4 years till we rolled out the next one. This strategy has to identify what Richard Rumelt describes as, what are the hard problems that we as a nation need to face? And how are we going to address those hard problems? And how are we going to do this? As I said, we've done it before, but a word of caution is that we just can't update the old strategy. Even in the last 4 years, the National Defense Strategy or the National Security Strategy, which is a broader strategy, has changed considerably. And if we roll that out, if the new strategy looks like the old one, then we're not doing a good job. So we have true peer competitors today and on the horizon. So how do we think of competing, as Al said, with a competitor that has a strong economy, a strong military, and a geopolitical plan that seems to be working? This question is really just one of the ones we need to ask ourselves and analyze the answers. We need to ask ourselves questions like, what does it really mean to compete in a multipolar world? In fact, we need to ask ourselves what the heck a multipolar world means today. How do we find and foster the new voices of Americans that are passionate about the future of the United States and the world? I mean, I look back and, and I'll say this, I'd say it even if he wasn't there, I had Al Schaefer as a mentor. I had Andy Marshall as a mentor. I had Jim Schlesinger, Josh Letterberg from Rockefeller University, and a whole host of others. So how do we find these people? And how do we help them and we foster them? How do we change 50 plus years of old management paradigms? Because fundamentally, in my view, you can write all the strategies you want, but if the organization looks like the old organization, nothing's going to change. Don Rumsfeld was famous for saying, if you want to keep the organization, change the name. If you want to change the organization, keep the name. So let's keep the name and go change the organizations. Bureaucracies are actually a good thing. So how do we think of another question? How do we think of a world where cyber and information will be the dominant forms of warfare and not big hardware? How do we understand the cultural changes we're seeing? So the technological innovation, as Melissa points out, and is not an American birthright. I'm sorry if that's a surprise to anybody. So, and then again, how is the rest of the world reconfiguring, and what are those implications? There are a lot more questions, and I think you'll have your own. And the key is that we need to get them on the table, and we have to be serious about analyzing and implementing. And so I'll close by saying all the things that I've raised today are not new. I mean, we know how to do this. Now we have to be, I mean, we used to be good at it. Now we have to be great at it. We just can't be better anymore. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. As normal, you said something up front that I think was actually brilliant and something I have not seen people talk about in this space. And that is redefinition from great power competition to great powers competition. And that takes it out of the let's worry about just the tangible economic, military, and political to what values do we want to protect as Americans with our friends and allies? Do we want to protect the values of respect for intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera? So I'm going to ask all of you that as we go into the moderated session. But the way you said that, I don't know if you realized it, but that got me thinking about the problem immediately in a different way. And I think that's the purpose in what we're trying to do here. So thank you very much. I will now turn to our last panelist, Dr. Lori Giandomenico. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Keoki Jackson has beaten it into me. Lori has an amazing background. She's been in and out of MITRE a couple of times and gone off to industry where she's been a CEO and senior industrial representative. Jason Pravadakis, the CEO of MITRE, brought her back to be first the primary acceleration officer and then stand up agility, which is really about how do we bridge the gap between federal funding and industry. I think I have that right. So Lori, I'm going to turn it over to you and look forward to your comments.
Thank you, Al, and thank you to the Potomac Institute and also to, of course, the speakers that I'm joined by. I think we're all in great alignment. I think of my kids when they were in elementary school. This is what you do in the school when you agree with what the teacher is saying. So I kept doing this as all of you were talking. Yes, I started my career at MITRE. I think what's relevant there is MITRE's worked for over 60 years for government, back when government did have more of the R&D dollars. And as Melissa points out, that's not the case today. A lot has changed in 60 years. And as Jamie points out, we can't update the old strategy. So I want to talk a little bit about that, about industry, about how we think about industry and government working together. And, you know, MITRE in the last 4 years when I came back, it was to create an accelerator, a tech accelerator to bring IP and capabilities to industry. I call it innovation for public good. Companies work on innovation for profit and government works on public good. How do we actually bring those two things together? And what does that mean? What does that mean for competition? So those are all the questions that I think about and work on every day as we're doing our work with industry. And one of the reasons that we did that in the last few years is because one of our greatest national security vulnerabilities is the private sector. Free market internet allows our IP to be stolen and siphoned. And at the same time, the R&D investment by the private sector, as we pointed out, is 3 times more than that of government. And so the private sector is both our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. The last numbers that I read, the industry R&D investment was around 600 billion. And China's economic espionage alone is estimated to cost us more than 300 billion. So while the private sector is an R&D powerhouse, over half or more of the equivalent of this is being siphoned off by China and other places. So I would say industry is competing against each other, but there's a far more significant competitor among us. And this threat obviously is only going to increase. I think we'll be talking later about, should we focus on China and Russia? Should we focus more broadly? But I think the point is that we shouldn't just focus on industry competing against each other and then all of that innovation for naught, right? Not actually getting pumped back into our economy, pumped back into making people's lives better. And how do we fix that? Not to mention all of the economic losses that have cascading effects on our country, you know, loss of industries, loss of domestic production capabilities, loss of jobs, reliance on others, trade imbalances. So all of the things that means. And so really both our vision and a vision I want to talk about today is how do we turn competition actually into a force for good? Because companies do respond to competition. People respond to competition. So I guess I would submit, competition isn't a bad thing. How do you make it something that can be productive and lead towards greater productivity? And really, how do we find this common goal that's higher than profits for any one company? Because the things that we have to be working on are things that no one company can solve. So, 5G is estimated to link 125 billion devices by 2030, spanning from customer devices to industrial sensors. AI, the time it takes to train large image classification systems on cloud infrastructure has fallen from 3 hours to 88 seconds in the last 2 years. The race to quantum computing is going to bring about a security crisis, and computing power is now doubling every 3 to 4 months, significantly faster than the 2 years of Moore's law. And then, of course, semiconductors, we saw the chip shortage in the auto industry and what that led to. I think the theme here, though, and reason it's so relevant to us is it's deep tech. It's not even just industry. It's deep tech. It's hyperscalers like Google, Facebook, Microsoft. So it's sort of how do we work within deep tech? And I think one of the problems with deep tech is it also involves infrastructure and labs. These things cost overhead. It's not the same as just investing in a software company and those software multiples that have 3-year returns. So if we want to really win with deep tech, we have to also be willing to make longer term investments. And again, that paradigm, we've shifted away from that paradigm. So I think there are opportunities to continue to figure out how to work with these industries, how to work with government and make competition a force for good. But we really have to understand the underpinning structure, the investment. So it's not just sort of these deep tech industries, it's the investment profiles and what that means. And so I guess I would say, I think of it as, we call it radical collaboration, is how do you get companies to work together? And you can think about, so MITRE, 99% of the black box data of all the US aircraft that fly over the US airspace goes through MITRE's databases. How did we get JetBlue to share their crown jewels with us, right? And even though we're working with the FAA to be trusted, that we're not going to share that data, but instead we're going to actually be doing analytics, deep learning and analytics on what are the safest things that we can do today. We no longer have planes falling out of the sky. We have near misses and bad takeoffs and bad landings. How do we do analytics and go back to JetBlue and say, hey, on this airspace and this aircraft, you could have done this better, or go back to United and share that with them? Because industry knows that if planes fall out of the sky, our business is over. So we have to create some sort of overarching goal that's higher than their profits that they'll listen to, and higher than government's purpose, which is safety, security, and prosperity for all. How do we figure out what's higher than that? It's planes falling out of the sky. That's not good for anyone. So what's the equivalent of planes falling out of the sky in each of these deep tech industries? In 5G, if China is defining the standards for use case and defining the standards for these new use cases, right? Chinese drones are going to be in our backyards, watching everything we do. That doesn't seem like a very good idea. So we have to win the race to 5G. And that's just one example. I do think, we'll be talking more about this. We talked a little bit about COVID and what that's meant. There's a good and a bad side to these things. I think when we are challenged, there's nothing like America standing up and bringing its best to bear on that challenge. If you look at the space race, look at NASA and what happened with the space race, what came out of all that innovation, right? Our cell phones, our laptops, solar, toothpaste in a tube. Mike Rogers was just talking about that recently at a speech that he gave. But I think it's really true. So the question is, what good can come out of getting industry and government to work together? How can we focus it on the right kind of key areas where our future is going to be at stake, right? And I think this idea of cooperation and competition is not that new. I worked with Barry Nailboff out of Harvard, out of Yale. He'd be upset if he heard me say that. Out of Yale in the 1990s, and he wrote a book called Co-opetition. And it was based on game theory and when do companies do better if they work together versus compete. But it was all based on competition in an industry vacuum. It wasn't about sort of a global landscape. I think the other thing that's changed when you think about a global landscape is ideas of sort of neoclassical economics, where every country build the things that they do best and contribute it, and then free trade will allow us all to benefit from that. That's not the case. And we still operate, I think America too often still operates on that mindset. And so we have to realize that the world is not how it used to be. Things are a little more warped. These deep tech industries are incredibly crucial for us to perform in. It involves a different investment profile. It involves training our workforce. It involves a really important piece of connecting R&D to industry. Too many times there's that valley of death, and the R&D does not make it to industry, or it gets siphoned off by China. So I think these are the things that we have to be concerned about. I guess I would just end with sort of 3, 4, 5 things that we think about when we think about how do we make industry productive and also meet the goals of a higher good, which is this idea of innovation for public good. How do we they still should make money, they still should be competitive. One is radical collaboration, and to me, that's defining a higher charter. In every industry you're in and in every problem you're trying to solve, you have to find a way to define it in a way that all of the conflicting or competitive forces would agree with. You know, in 5G, we've got Nokia, Ericsson, Verizon, Qualcomm, all coming together for our open generation R&D collaborative to focus on use case innovation for drones, because we want to be able to drive what that structure, standards, policy, technology breakthroughs beyond line of sight for drones. We want to drive what that looks like. Second one is impact-driven investment. So how do we make sure that we're shaping the investments that are happening and focusing on things that are going to have the right impact and outcome, still make money, right? You can do both, but you can't do both if you don't actually define what the impact outcome should look like. Democratic alliances, you know, I think trying to make sure that you're engaging and investing in a global industry and finding those countries and organizations that align with your philosophy. So we look for that in each of the deep tech areas that we're focused on. The creation of new sustainable markets. So as you're thinking about R&D and where you're going to put R&D investments, and we're thinking a lot about the semiconductors and the money that government's going to be putting into that. How do we make sure that those investments are towards the creation of a sustainable market? And we've launched the Semiconductor Alliance to actually bring industry together, helping to figure out where those investments should be placed. And then the fifth is adherence to the principles of democratic alliances. So agreeing what those principles are, what we're going to do and not do, and why. And so putting some guardrails, you know, especially as you think about these hyperscalers, you know, Facebook and Microsoft and Google, how do we put some guardrails and think about what are some ways that we can make money in profitable ways that are actually good for our country and good for everyone. I'll just end there. I have lots of other thoughts about deep tech, but I'm sure it will come up in the questions. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to participate.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lori. Since we're just a couple minutes ahead of schedule, which no one ever believed we would be, I'm going to take a moderator's prerogative and ask each of you for your reaction to this, because it's tying together thoughts that you all brought out. And Melissa, you talked about great powers competition for us to think about how do we bring people together for societal good? How do we raise things up that allow people to compete? Laura, you talked about deep tech, and Jamie, you talked about a little bit about what values. But I'm going to go back a couple of years. And about 10 years ago, I almost remember no speeches anybody ever gives. But I went to an In-Q-Tel meeting where Skunk Baxter was talking, and Skunk talked about the impact of the internet in allowing people to go find their own tribes effectively, and kind of the end of nationalism. Now, we clearly don't have the end of nationalism, but as we think about where we are heading in the future, and we see this every day now, if you are a Democrat, you go to MSNBC. If you're a hardcore Republican, you go to Fox News and get all of your beliefs reinforced. So people can use the internet to go off and find their tribe. In that, how do we think about that, especially with regard to freedom of speech and individual liberties? Can we even pull the United States and our allies together? Or are we in this world of increased tribalism that's going to continue to tear at us? So it's kind of a long question. I will let any of you come up on point first. And Melissa, you're smiling and shaking your head. So I will let you go first.
You know me, I always have something to say. But I think actually the crux of this is what an alliance is, right? An alliance isn't we agree with each other. An alliance is we see value in coexisting because we've defined an outcome that is meaningful and powerful for both of us, right? So I live in Missouri right now, and I had someone doing drywall for me, and he wanted to know whether he hated me or he loved me. And there were clearly going to be only two choices. So he loved me because I'm from Southeast Missouri, so I'm even more country than he is, right? But he hated me because I was an Obama political appointee. And then he loved me because that was at the Pentagon. But then he hated me because I lived in DC. And he's like, I just don't know what to make of you. And I'm like, well, you could maybe just stick to the drywall. I have money and you have drywall skills, and I will trade you for those things. And he came back the last time that he came, because he had to come several times. He said, I want to talk to you. I want to talk to you. I'm like, tell me, Dwayne, what do you want me to know? And he shares all these like real concerns that he has. And I was like, those are valid. And I don't have the same concerns necessarily, but we both want to coexist as neighbors who mow our lawns and get our drywall fixed and who spread our money locally and support a community, and we want our roads fixed. And he was like, I would have you as a neighbor. And he just leaves, right? And I thought to myself, like, that's what we've lost. What we've decided is like, it's more important to make a point and to suffer than to like figure out how to coexist and succeed. And somehow we've got to reshape this concept of alliances. And that's why I talk about domestic alliances so much. We've lost the art of negotiation, of understanding, and quite frankly, of space, of giving people who disagree with you space to breathe and to go do disagreeable things amongst themselves. I do think when America is at our best, we've never been agreeable. Go back to the beginning, read a history of this nation. It is messy. We fight with each other and others. We have never had a time when people didn't own guns. We are a messy, chaotic country, but we've always had a higher vision, largely of the ability to coexist and not have to become homogenous, that allowed us to figure out how to be citizens under a single umbrella. And so much what Lori was saying about industry, that you need this thing above profits, right, that drives them. What we've stopped doing in America is giving them something above their individual ideology to believe in, which used to be, you're going to get your roads fixed. You're going to have a decent public education for your kids. You're going to be taken care of either by your community or your government. And we stopped taking care of people. And there's no one who's getting health care. There's no one who feels really like it's easy for their kids to get an easy public education. I think we have to really go back to the roots of what does this country look like if we win this competition? And you can't start measuring performance and having metrics if you don't know what you're trying to do. And I just think we've lost that vision. And we don't know how to build alliances.
Melissa, thank you. That was actually a terrific answer. Lori or Jamie, do either of you want to come up on? Lori, I see you're up.
Of course, resonates with me. I was going to say, I think when there's too much effort focused on why the other person or ideology or company is not good and why ours is better. There's no clear messaging about the value, to me, the value proposition. And there isn't messaging that starts to bring people together. There's less focus on that, because if you're bringing people together, you're not focused on why that other guy is bad. I mean, there is, if you think about industry, you should be differentiating. How are you different from everyone else? You've got to talk about the value proposition of your products. I think, again, that's sort of a more, I would say, more traditional way of thinking about industry, and even industry has to evolve and reinvent itself. So no, I mean, I don't have anything more to add there, except to say that tribalism can be good, because if you've got an idea that everybody kind of gets behind, then it foments this sort of continuity, and you can get something done. But I think we need more visionary leaders that speak to people with messages that resonate, and then you can get people sort of excited about pulling in one direction. And we don't have enough of that. It's too much about, this.
Thank you. By the way, I was talking to General Gray and thinking about the whole topic of strategic messaging that we may have gotten away from. So it's kind of all comes together.
I was going to say, Al, I hesitated to bring this up, but the analogy was in business is about brands. I've done a lot of work on creating strong brands. And I talk a lot about, if a brand really stands for something, you've got to think through what that means. And it's got to have a purpose to it that's more meaningful than selling its products. And, people sort of criticize, I used to do some work with the Dove brand, right? And it was when Sylvia Lognato came up with the idea that it wasn't just going to be about 1/4 moisturizing cream. It was actually going to be about real beauty. And what does real beauty mean? And in order to sell this idea to the Unilever board, she actually did videotapes with their daughters and their sisters and their wives talking about their thoughts about beauty and why, their granddaughter thought that her freckles were ugly. And it really became meaningful. And you might laugh because they're making money, but Dove is touching billions of people around the world and putting money into this idea of raising awareness about real beauty. And they've been doing that for a long time. I always say that you have to have a brand that's meaningful, that stands for something, and then you have to be willing to deliver on it. And unfortunately, it's a dynamic world. The molecules are always moving. So as the brand continues to stretch and grow, you have to deliver, it grows, and you deliver. And that distance between the promise and the deliver is tricky. That's the art part of it. Because if you're too far ahead, you fall right in and that brand doesn't go anywhere. And if you're a commodity, then it's not inspiring enough. I think we need more of that, not just in industry, but in government. I think our leaders need to be talking about, what do you stand for? What is it going to mean? How's it going to help everybody? And how are you going to show me in each little thing you do that I'm actually delivering? You're delivering on that thing. And then a year later, you're saying, remember that promise I made? I'm still delivering on it. Here's what I mean by that. And I think that's a metaphor for more than, I think it's a metaphor for the kind of leadership that we need.
Excellent. Jamie, anything to add?
Yeah, thanks, Al. And Lori and Melissa, thank you. I mean, I'm reminded of a couple of things based on what Melissa was talking about, winning and what does that mean? I mean, Eisenhower, when he was the president and he was being encouraged by his staffs to basically take out the Soviet Union before it got too big and too unwieldy, stood up and looked around the room and he said, okay, great. He said, what do we do after we get it? I mean, we gotta think about that. So winning is maybe not winning in the case, and as it turns out, probably was the best decision he never made. I'm also mindful of something else Melissa was saying about a messy, chaotic country, which again, this goes back to Jim Schlesinger, who is famous for saying that democracy is relatively messy, especially our form of democracy is relatively messy and takes a lot of time, but ultimately we get things right. And I'm not sure that Jim today would be saying the same thing, because I look at the world today much like the football teams of today versus the football teams of 50 years ago. Melissa, sorry, I've been around that long. But they are, you know, the players are bigger, faster, and more lethal than ever. And so is the world today. It's bigger, it's faster, it's more lethal than ever. And I don't think that we can afford to kind of indulge ourselves in the kind of messy, chaotic thinking that we have done in the past. And we have to get really serious about understanding what that world is going to look like. On the issue of alliances, I absolutely agree with you on alliances, but I focus more, I think, on diplomacy. I think that the art of diplomacy is dead. I mean, and it's buried well below 6 feet, and it was probably incinerated before they buried it, so it can't ever be recreated. But the notion of the great diplomats, and unfortunately, and you know, they were all old white men, but the great diplomats of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries actually got things done in this world. Now, we may not like what happened in some cases, and maybe a lot of cases, but for the most part, they were actually pretty good at keeping a lid on what I call the teapots around the world, which eventually, you know, things get so hot that the teapot starts to boil and the cap comes off. But they were good at it. But the diplomats are gone. And as we saw in, you know, my view, what happened in the Quad, and then the response from China and others, the Quad in Alaska, and the response from China and others. In fact, if you look at the literature, the Chinese are patting themselves on the back because they are retiring their old diplomats, and they are bringing in what they call the wolves. These are, I mean, this is serious. These people are not interested in diplomacy. They are interested in winning at all costs. So, you know, and then Al, you know, going back to the notion of tribes and we at the foundation, but I in particular, I'm very interested in this notion of tribes. Sam Huntington's book, which was not necessarily well received when he wrote it on the Clash of Civilizations, is a must read for people today to try to understand what's going on in this world. Sam's subsequent book is equally good. But we're talking about tribes, civilizations, religions. We're talking about ideologies. I mean, Putin is not just the leader of Russia. He is an ideology in and of himself. You know, Modi in India is not the leader of a political party. He is a leader of an ideology. And I tell you, if you go and look at that ideology, it is antithetical to US democracy. So as we think about building our alliances with India and giving them all this great technology, we have to think about where India is going to be in 20 or 30 years and say, are they on our side? And you know, are they really an ally? You know, President, Premier, Chairman Xi in China, he has, although he hasn't announced it yet, he's going to do it pretty soon, I'm sure. But he has replaced the second C in CCP with the word Confucius. So it's no longer communism. This is not communism. This is Confucianism in China. And if you understand what Confucianism is all about, that's an ideology. It's not a religion. Now think about the changes, the structural and geographic changes across the world over the next 30 years. We keep talking about mega cities and how it's going to be so great because we're going to have 5G, 10G, and everybody's going to be wired in these mega cities. We're going to have 50 million people there. Well, these mega cities are going to be centers for foment and exciting times, because if you think about Washington, D.C., I don't know about Columbia, Missouri, Melissa, but New York City, they're big cities, but they are all, frankly, tribes. All these neighborhoods are different tribes. They were raised as different tribes. You go to Little Italy, you go to Little, you know, Ireland, and all the places around town, little, you know, Chinatown, things of that nature. What does that mean for these mega cities that actually are going to cross borders? You know, what does it mean for mega cities in the United States? How are we thinking about that as we think about competitive nature of the future? And then when you throw in technology and the ability of other countries and frankly, other people, forget about the countries, but people around the world who are getting much smarter and much more capable at building capabilities that can be used for good and equally bad, how are we going to deal with that? So with that, I think I've talked too long, but we can go to I can let Melissa and Laurie talk. I'm sorry.
Jamie, that was very good. And I'm told we have a number of questions online, and I will also poll the room here. But I'm going to challenge each of you and the people in the room. About a year and a half ago, and again, time gets very confused as you start to get up in years. But a year and a half ago, The Economist magazine termed 100. I wasn't Joe. I was looking for a mirror. They had their either 100, 125th, 150th edition, and they talked about the loss of the ideals of the liberal democracy that started, that The Economist was started to espouse. And we kind of hit on this, Jamie, in your great powers competition. I think we need to think about, from a US and allied perspective, what are the values that we want to protect and advance? And I'm not going to say which one, but I will say I've been in rooms with military leaders in the department where they start going down the values of our perception of China, and our values and their values are very much opposed. And that may be where the competition is. It may be in protection of intellectual property and respect for intellectual property. And it may be in free market trade. And it may be in fair competition. And it may be in human rights. But I'm going to challenge everybody in the room, and to feed those into Tim, what are the values that we believe are important enough that we cannot let go of in a great powers competition? So with that, I think, how are we going to do the question session? I can't read.
Al?
So first of all, just within the room here, if you do have questions, if you want to just go ahead and write them down, and we'll send them our way, and we'll adjudicate them that way. And then also we do have some here online that we could start reading. One, if you'd like.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry. I want to get to something Al just talked about values and about culture. It gets to cultures, and it really goes to what Laurie was talking about, and in a sense that we've got to think about how values are manifested in the future and who builds them. I look around at the folks that are on the call here, and not necessarily Laurie and Melissa, but there are several generations that have come along since we showed up, and so their value systems are different than ours. The value systems of the Chinese are different than ours. But can you use, because there's a question on misinformation, can we use the marketplace to drive values that get to different outcomes in the future? And with that, I'm sorry for interrupting.
I could jump on that for a second. The idea of using the marketplace for values, because if you think about competition, the idea of perfect competition is that the best product will win, which means consumers will choose the best products and therefore the best companies will win. Again, it's an ideal, and there are lots of things keeping that from working, but there is some value, I think, to the idea of people choosing based on what works for them. And so that creates this sort of fair competition. So a sort of new form of perfect competition. And then you can think about industries where regulation, right? And I don't think actually policy is a dirty word. And this was another point I was going to make, is I think that policy and regulation should be a way to help make competition productive for people, instead of thought of as a dirty word by industry. And there's this sort of like fight back and forth. So I think those are good things, but there are times and examples where that hasn't been the case. If you think about healthcare systems, right? They're so inextricably tied. You've got hospital systems and insurance systems and these vendors, and the vendors all make everything proprietary. So you can't have one data connect to another data system. And it's just it's a mess, and not in the good way that Melissa's talking about. Because why? It gets in the way of perfect competition and of actual productive value being delivered. Hospital systems want data to be safe and protected and be able to use it and be able to do innovation and innovative things with it. So I think, how do we determine values? By creating a system where the products have to deliver what they say they're going to deliver. So maybe that theme is deliver what you say you're going to deliver. Say what you're going to deliver what you say you're going to deliver, say what you're going to deliver again, right? And that's, again, brand, deliver, promise, deliver, promise, deliver. And we set our values based on the ability to show that you're demonstrating, what you say you're going to. That's how you create trust. I mean, if you think about, David Maister wrote a book a long time ago called The Trust Equation. And it was the idea that it was reliability, credibility, intimacy. He actually put an equation to trust, all divided by self-interest. So no matter how much you've earned trust, it's divided by you doing what's right for you instead of what's right for others. So I think values based on sort of some of those principles, creating trust and delivering what you say you're going to deliver, we need to bring it back. And how do we create incentives that further those?
Pretty good discussion, folks. So we have some questions. Tim, why don't you? So the first one is about how do we think about reducing military spending?
I'll go back to that one real quick. Sure.
Because I thought that was kind of a good question. I'd like to get their response.
I think I can read that one if you want, Al.
Okay, can you read it, Melissa?
No, I have it on my big screen here. No American wants to be in an inferior military position, but might we be better served by reducing our emphasis and spending on pure defense and spreading our R&D spending more broadly across our nation's interests and concerns? I'll just hop on that a little bit because I've been stalking this question. I would say one of the things I think the government needs to think about is more than just spending. We can not spend our way back to 1960. There is not enough money in the world. It is a different landscape. And so, but I do think this idea of actually thinking about the nation's interests and concerns and perhaps changing the role of the federal government to make sure those interests and concerns are taken into account and are addressed is critical. So perhaps what we can do is build alliances and coalitions around problems. And then the federal government has an amplifying role. Your money goes a lot further if you're matching industry money, if you're matching philanthropic money. It goes a lot further if you're sharing lessons learned and saying, when a community had your characteristics and tried to address this problem, this failed, this succeeded. If it helps ensure that brains and talent don't all have to leave home to go to a mega city in order to have a job, right? And you actually strengthen communities so that they have a capacity and a reserve to solve their own problems. These things are really critical, and we've hollowed out a lot of communities by only focusing on the federal government and only focusing on money. And I think we really have to reconsider what the role of the federal government is in a period where our checkbook is not the singular most important role that the government can actually bring to the table.
Thank you, Melissa. Laurie or Jamie, you want to take that one on also, or are you comfortable with Melissa's answer?
I'm perfectly comfortable with Melissa's answer. I was kind of stalking the question too. I think it comes back to that whole valley of death, right? You've got a startup community coming up with the best of what America does, ingenuity and coming up with new ideas. And we're stopping it before it gets started because we're not investing in how do we propel that innovation into bigger companies so they can actually get commercialized. And I think that's so it has to do with investment, right? The investment profiles, and we don't have enough deep tech investment. We don't have enough focus on taking, not just deep tech, but taking R&D and making sure that it can be commercialized. So Yeah, no, I think I agree. There's not much more I had there.
I've got a skeptical approach to this. So it's an interesting question, but for me is that we can do anything we want with spending money, but we have not defined what our real goals and objectives are. And until you do that, how do you say how much money I'm going to spend on this or spend on that? So if we did a better job at defining what our goals and objectives are as a nation, and actually making sure that our military, who have different goals and objectives when we ask them to go to war, different goals and objectives than the political objectives, clearly understand the political objectives, and that the politicians clearly understand the military objectives. So then we can probably get a more rational way to spend money on defense. And frankly, I'm picking on defense because I spend a lot of time in it, but I would say the same thing about education in America. I would say the same thing about science and technology. I would say the same thing about just about every sector of this country, is that we keep throwing money at the wall, expecting it to solve problems, and we don't even know what the problem is we're trying to solve. So with that, off my soapbox.
Maybe one thing I would just add there is is speed, which is that I think we do need to define those objectives, but we need to accelerate our speed of innovation, our ability to innovate faster. I think there's an analogy in cybersecurity. I think the previous ways of thinking about cybersecurity were just create bigger walls and don't let them in, Symantec and McAfee, and just making sure that we're trying to keep people out. And this sort of threat-informed defense approach that we took in both to our own organization, I think in the industry, is the idea they're going to get in. We know they're going to get in. So the question is, when they get in, what are they trying to do? How are they trying to do it? And where are the best places to create protection? And let's then innovate within that. So this idea of, back to your goals, Jamie, I think in order to create good goals and a clear picture, you have to have guidelines, sort of like, okay, within this area, now innovate and innovate quickly, because we know what we need to solve. We know what problems we need to solve. The David Ogilvy, I often quote guidance, which was to say there's nothing more freeing than a really tight creative brief, right? This idea that if you provide the parameters and then let people innovate within that, so that it doesn't have to mean you're not going faster, you're just setting goals and then accelerating innovation.
Yeah, thanks,
Thank you
Laurie.
very much. By the way, and this is just an anecdote I'm going to throw out there. I'm not going for an answer on anything on this. But when I was in NATO, I made up a briefing trying to get more investment in advanced technologies. And at that time, there was the 2% pledge that every nation would spend 2% of their GDP on defense. So I did the calculations, and that came to $128 billion per year. That wouldn't all go to R&D, of course, but that $128 billion would be then freed up in the U.S. or some portion of it for doing other types of things, worrying about societal problems. And then the Germans said, that's all very well and good. Our spending is way down, but we're spending 0.75% of our GDP on foreign relations and foreign aid, which is another way to get at national security problems. And, I stopped and thought about that, and it's a pretty logical argument. And, it's not just about military spending, but it's how do you start to work at the threats in other nations? Just an observation.
Yeah, so Al, I think you're right. To Laurie's issues, I'm talking more about national goals and objectives and not tactical goals and objectives. And, so cyber is a very important issue that we can go as fast as we want in cyber. The question, that's not the issue. It's a decision that's got to be made by the leadership to go faster. But I'm talking about national goals and objectives, which gets to Al's point about, and Melissa's original discussion about national security being much bigger than defense. If our goals and objectives are focused on the national security of this country, frankly, my belief is that our budgets and strategies should be focused on the national security of the country. And those investments need to be made there. And I'm always mindful of something that I learned a long time ago, is that speed kills. So we've got to be very careful.
I want to jump in and just say as well that if we're thinking about the future, and the point that Jamie made about generations coming up behind us, I think is really important. I don't think that there should be an assumption in Washington that you know what people want and that you know what their values are, and that their values are free market or free trade. I don't think you know that about Americans, honestly. And I think that you have to be very careful about planning for a future that looks like 1960 without talking about the people that are going to lead that future, who were born in 2000, right? So I think really ensuring that we take a step back and we have a real conversation around this country. I mean, I think there could be some incredible surveys here about what are the three things, right? And give them some choices, not healthcare, but what are the three things you think it's most important for the world to know about this country, right? Or what could the government do for you that would make you trust them, right? I mean, there are some fundamental questions that we think we know the answers to because we wrote some answers down in the 80s, but I don't think that that's actually how most people feel anymore. And we're making some assumptions that they care about the rich getting richer, and they don't. And we're making some assumptions that they think that pure capitalism and free trade is good. And many of them will tell you the reason populism is on the rise, not only in the US, but also in Europe, is because they don't actually think that worked out so well for them. So I think we need to be extremely careful about this question of values and what our societal values are. We need to revisit them, because if we're planning for the 20 to 40-year future, you can't start with a false set of assumptions. And I would argue that I think right now we're in danger of starting with a false set of assumptions.
Melissa, I very much agree with you. And that comes back around to the Andy Marshall discussion of what question are we trying to answer and what are we trying to address. But one of the things that I asked for here is Potomac has some really good interns. And you talked about, getting a generational difference. So I'm told, and I have no idea what this question is, but Carrie Reiner is a PIPS intern, and she has a question that Tim says is good. So Carrie, over to you. No pressure, no pressure.
Hello, thank you for letting me ask this question today. Before you even brought up the point about how values can change, according to who you talk to in America, I was kind of wondering, listening to the conversation going on in this room, it's very different in some ways than the conversations that I have with my peers. There's a lot of, I guess the way a lot of my peers talk about, the economy is very, very different, perhaps naive, perhaps not, I'm not sure. But it kind of got me thinking about how different historical time periods shape the values of each generation. And, I'm sure all of you have been impacted by the pandemic in your own ways, but I know there's a lot of research coming out, or a lot of questions about how the pandemic and reliance on technology is going to shape my generation and even, the students who are younger. And so my question to you is, what values do you think that are primarily American values and that drive this sort of competition that we're talking about transcend historical time periods, whether you're talking about Americans who've lived through the Cold War, Americans who maybe even lived through the Second World War, or Americans like myself who, were born in 2001 around 9/11.
Melissa teed that up very well, and I don't even know if that was planned there.
I feel like I should thank her. I'll take a stab at just some thoughts on that. And I think honestly, what I would say to you is that it would be amazing for you and your peers to come back with your own answer to this question and to have us listen to you. Because I think one of the things that gets us into a difficulty of framing the right questions is an inability to listen without thinking about what we're going to say while we're doing said listening, right? And so I feel like I'd love to come to a meeting where you take some of these questions and you guys are the panel and you answer our questions. So for another day, I just put that out there. I want that competition conversation. I would say that for me, I think some of the things that have transcended American values over time, and I would go back as far as the Revolutionary War, the Civil War. If you think about the United States, every 70 to 80 years, we have a big old fashioned war somewhere, right? Either on our own soil or someone else's. But one of the things that seems to transcend that is this belief that everyone should be given a right to a basic education, and that that education shouldn't keep you from making other choices later, right? It shouldn't matter if you make a choice today to get a trade degree, a certification in a trade. It doesn't keep you from going and getting a PhD later in your life and deciding you want to be a university professor. I think there's something really inherent in American values from early on that we shouldn't be told by others what we can and cannot do, right? Now, I think there are some negative aspects of that you see today, but there are some really positive aspects about that as well that make people believe, even when it seems insane, right, that they can succeed beyond what it would appear is easy for them. I do think we're making some choices now that are actually making those really long-standing inherent American values less true, less accessible. And I think public education is really one of the biggest challenges that we're kind of failing on, as far as I can see. That really was that promise. I don't really think we make a lot of other promises. We don't even promise you you're going to be happy. We're just going to let you try to be, right? We're going to let you pursue happiness. We're not going to give it to you. That we've never been a country that promised to give you stuff. We've always been a country that promised to kind of get out of your way while you tried to pursue it. So for me, that's a value that has been very American from the 1700s on. Now, that doesn't mean that has to be the value that we always hold, but it is something that I think people need to really remember when they believe, if I just have a good enough message, everyone's going to believe me and trust me and follow me. It's like there's going to be a certain portion of Americans that don't, just because they don't want to be told what to do. And that's very American. And so embrace it and figure out, how do you leverage that as a strength and not try to tamp it out as a weakness.
Lori or Jamie, anything?
I agree with Melissa. No, I do. I mean, my question was going to be back to you. Is it Carrie? Did I get that right?
Carrie.
Yeah. Which is, what values do you believe this country should have going forward? Now, forget about my values. I'm on the dark side of the curve here. But we do have value. I mean, I do. But what are the values that you and your generation believe are important for the future of this country? So I'm going to throw the question back at you. And how do we help you get there?
You can also say you need time to think about it, Carrie. I've worked with these guys a long time.
Well, I think it's definitely hard to answer for my entire generation, and I really can't speak for everybody. But I think two main ideas come to mind. One is sustainability. One thing I've noticed among many of my peers is that even though we live in a world immersed by technology, many of us have a desire to sort of engage more with our planet and recognize, our interactions with our planet in a way that, it doesn't seem like we've had a renewed focus on that, since the last maybe 1 or 2 decades. And so I feel like sustainability in many forms. I have friends working other internships through the fellowship I'm in who are working in lots of different activities. And one conversation we keep coming back to is sustainability. How do we have a sustainable, economy? How do we have a sustainable quality of life for citizens? How do we have a sustainable relationship with our planet? And I think that the answer maybe to me points to another value, or another, maybe not value, but trait that I think is very American, which is technological optimism. And I think that's something that I see throughout a lot of different generations. I mean, when you talk to anybody who got to see the moon landing, you hear the optimism in their voice talking about what we achieved when we, put all of our minds together to that purpose. And for me, I'm hoping to maybe go into space policy, and so that is something, technological optimism, that really drives my life as well. And so I feel like that maybe more of a trait than a value, but I feel like that trait is maybe, how we hope to achieve our value of sustainability in the future.
I'm going to take.
You should put her on this panel, Al. You should put her on this panel. That was a great
So much of
answer.
this, future in terms of competition and this,
You speak up, sir.
is dependent upon teamwork in the future. So are we talking about American values or international values? What about the other countries? Most of the less developed world, for example, they care more about security. That's the number one priority, and freedom and all that comes after that. If we don't have a certain amount of effort looking into how other people think about the same questions we're trying to answer as Americans, we're not gonna hit the international value of this whole thing.
Right.
And that's where I think we have to go some thought.
I absolutely agree. And again, it's defining this problem and how wide do we want the aperture.
Yeah.
But I am gonna go back. Carrie, how many interns are there this semester?
I think there's 3 of us in the policy program.
Okay, so what I'm going to ask the 3 of you to have a 1 or 2 hour session, and any of the other folks who are in that generation, and have a discussion about what values do you think are important moving forward for this great powers competition. Because if we're going after the wrong values, I don't know if winning and losing matters, but we won't win. So if you can do that, that would be very, very helpful and very valuable. And that's a good problem for you to think about.
I would also just encourage you, Carrie. I think the 2 answers you gave are pretty amazing. And I would say if you looked at history, sustainability is actually something we used to think a lot more about. We didn't call it, we didn't name it that, but there used to be sort of, agriculture used to be very sustainable before we got to the 80s, where we got to corporate farming, right? You used to have farmers who really thought about, how do I make sure this land is sustainable for generations to come, because I'm going to give this land to my kids, right? We used to have these really interesting partnerships between hunters and conservationists, because they wanted there to be land that was preserved that they could all use. So we used to have these really interesting relationships that were forged, and a lot of this started breaking down in the 80s. And so I think it would be interesting also for you all to think about these, and then to actually look back historically. I think you might find that many of these things you're talking about, they are actually very American, but maybe we've lost our way on a few of these. I think there's something really important here, and really interesting to dig into. And I would also just say, from this idea of we need to think about internationally as well, I agree. I think one of the biggest challenges Washington has is, it's not Washington and other governments internationally, it's our government and those governments, and then it's our people and those people. Because I think what we'll find is that we do have very different values than people in China, but they are not homogenous, and we are not homogenous. And so we have to be very careful about putting everything through a nationalist government lens.
Yeah, Melissa and Carrie and Lori and Jamie, I'm gonna make this statement. One of the other values that I grew up with, that it was an American value, is that if you had the ability, you could advance. I am questioning whether or not that's true for all of our citizens now. I mean, I grew up, and you guys know where I came from. I grew up very poor, but I had the opportunity to advance and, you know, have what most people would consider a fairly successful life. I'm worried that we are cutting off some portion of our population from having that same type of opportunity to move forward. And I don't think we have a big enough country to not let everybody achieve everything they can achieve. So I'm just throwing that out there. Reactions?
Can I say something real quick?
Yes.
That lends to something else Carrie actually mentioned. You know, she called it technological optimism, but just optimism overall seems to be a value and character, I think, of our country. And it goes, I think, it comes from those choices that Melissa was talking about earlier. You have a choice to make a change, right? And to Al's point, is that do we still have those choices, right? To the level that we have had historically. And if we don't, you know, how do we change that so we can continue to think about, you know, how we compete in the future moving forward? Are we as optimistic as we have been historically? And is that one of the values that we need to make sure that we're sticking to?
I was just going to build off of, I think that's a great question, just the optimism. I was going to build off of something previously, and Al, that was going to be my answer, but Carrie, and I'm so grateful she did, stole my thunder, which is awesome. And I don't mean it by saying I was going to say the same thing she said. I was going to say just that the point about fairness and the ability to be what we want to be, and the idea that a new generation could, you know, come in and take and provide direction. That we didn't have a caste system. There was no forced boxes we've had to stay in, I think, as Americans. That was the point. And I think your question now is that still the case as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? And again, the point about technology could offer a solution to that or not, depending on what we do, right? The solution is, how do we provide more high value jobs for people? How do we train and educate people and really elevate the level of workforce development for these new jobs, because of that will be required with technology, so that people can do what they want. And if you think about even the internet and the jobs that's provided, and the ability for people to create their own businesses online, and e-commerce and Shopify. I mean, with Shopify, you can create your own business in a few days and be up and running. So people really have the ability to do that. But can we continue to train them and help make sure that we're upskilling people in order to have those same freedoms that we had, you know, 30 and 50 years ago, where you could be whatever you wanted to be, because that was at the heart of American values, right?
And I will tie it back to my initial comments. As we continue to pile up national debt beyond where we can afford it, we're going to continue to cut off opportunity for all of our people. And that's something we have got to figure out. By the way, as a factoid, and this is where I first started getting really concerned about it, as we went into the pandemic and virtual learning, less than half of the children in Baltimore had access to the internet. They lost a year. And you lose a year in 4th or 5th grade, you may not come back. So I really question about, do we have a level playing field? Carrie, thank you very much. That was a good discussion.
No, another thing, it's important with what you mentioned again, is the work ethic. Most of us, for example, those of us who grew up through. Can I what?
Can you speak up a little bit, sir? I'm so sorry.
You want me to yell at you?
Yes, I love that.
We can't hear you out here in cyberspace.
Who grew up during the Depression and stuff like that, you know, working was something we all did. You know, I had my Social Security card when I was 11 years old. And so the point I want to make here is that work ethic was very important to the young people growing up. And I think those who carried on that work ethic did very well. So that should be somehow, you know, worked into this whole value proposition.
Absolutely agree.
The work ethic coupled with the education is a real plus. And that's good no matter what country you come from.
I would agree with that.
I also think every single one of us should be supporting the ability to write off student debt through bankruptcy. It's the only debt we don't clear. And we're lying to people that going to college is now something that's useful in many cases. And so it's all well and good to train people, but if people don't hire you unless you have a college education, and you can't get a college education for less than $300,000, you can work all you want at Taco Bell, but you can't go to college and pay your debt. And you can get a job making $80,000 in Missouri, but you'll still be paying your debt when you're dying, right? And so we have fundamentally changed the playing field to where no matter how hard you work and how long you work, we're not going to pay you enough to pay off your college debt, period. Like for a vast majority of people, I'm Gen X, and I know lots of people who are still carrying debt at 48. I can't imagine being in Carrie's generation and looking at the incredible cost that has now arisen to go to school. It's hundreds of times what it was when I went. And if we really want kids to be able to lead this nation, they have to be able to get an education, to get real critical thinking skills, to question. They can't just all be trained. Many of them have to be educated for this kind of thought. And they can't all come from Harvard and Yale and rich kids who've never had problems, right? We need people who know what it is to solve a problem with different types of resources at their disposal. Diversity of experience matters, whether people want to talk about it or not. If you've never had to solve a problem on your own without calling daddy, I don't want you running my country. I want someone who had to figure out some hard stuff and made it work, right? So I want to make sure we have some diversity of experience by the time we get to who's left to leading.
Melissa, can I will say one thing, and then we have another question. I think you hit on something that I struggle with a lot as we move forward with values. And the values are, we want our people to be educated, but I also think we want our people to honor a commitment if they enter into the commitment. And those aren't balanced fairly right now. So I struggle with the whole idea of forgiving college debt loan because people enter into an agreement. The discussion in my mind has to be, is there some other way people can do service to pay off some of that debt?
We all agree on this, Al. We talk about this all the time of civil service,
That way.
Yeah.
but we never do it.
We shouldn't have a situation where people have to borrow tons of money to get educated. You either can afford it or you can't, or you go to work. I mean, the woods are full of people who work their way through college and they're very successful. But I get this debt business. Maybe I just am too old.
It is an interesting, I will call it a dichotomy of values. And it's a hard problem because, you know, you don't want someone to have to work their entire life to pay off college debt that didn't give them the job that they wanted.
Or any job that will pay a living wage.
Yep.
I'm just saying college costs a lot more now than it used to.
It does. So we have a question I think is kind of interesting. It was earlier. Who in the US government should own the problem of global competition strategy development? So in other words, who owns this problem? Thoughts?
I would say the National Security Council, not as it's currently structured. If we look at national security as the way Melissa defined it at the beginning, and as a whole approach to the country, they should be the ones that are writing, that are drafting the national security strategy for the country, and with inputs from others, but that's where it's got to start. And if you don't start there and you want to start it in the Department of Defense, you're going to get a military strategy that's going to look like a national security strategy, or if you do it over commerce or state, you know, so, and, you know, right now it does start in a national security council, but I don't think they are organized properly, and frankly, probably do not have the right sorts of people to write a strategy.
Jamie, I have a quick question for you, just to build on that thinking. As national security and economic stability come closer together, and one way that we have to protect ourselves is the ability to ensure that we have this, economic cohesion, I guess. How do you write a national security strategy and include sort of those ideas? Or where does one end and the other begin? And do you think NSC would be able to do that?
No, so Lisa, Laurie, I'm sorry. It's a great question. The answer to the end of it is that no, the NSC is currently structured is not dealing with national economic issues. I'm saying that if you're serious about national security, you've got to include economic issues and everything else. But I'm one of those people, and maybe it's because I'm just too old to remember, that actually believes that that economic security has always been important to us from the beginning of the founding of this country. So this is what we're going through today is blown up, I think, a lot by what I call the Washington Post. You wake up in the morning, you read the Washington Post, and you say, "Oh my God, what is it?" But nobody. I mean, I don't want to say nobody. I mean, I suspect that there are a fair number of Americans who have no clue what debt ceiling means or what the debt is or how it impacts them. So we've got to be very careful. But going back to your broader question, there is a National Economic Council. I don't think that they necessarily talk to the National Security Council, although they do get a shot at helping write things. But there's no one editor. I mean, that's the other thing I would get. I would get a one editor who writes the whole thing in one voice. And then we pay attention to it, not just kind of say, here it is, roll it out. And we'll see you again in 4 years, folks.
I want to build on that.
What about the vice president?
Wrong person, Al. I mean, the vice president has other wrong, not person necessarily, it's the wrong office. The vice president has other duties as assigned by the Constitution and the president. And the vice president can be part of the team that leads it. But that's what, to me, is what you have a National Security Council for. And the National Security Advisor, this National Security Advisor, by the way, I kind of like. I mean, I like Condi Rice too, and others, but they get so focused and fixated on what's on their calendar every day. They don't have to, they don't really have the time to think the big picture. Jamie's view.
If this is important, then we need to find the people to be able to think big picture. And someone here just wrote down the word cabinet. And that may not be a bad answer. How many people how many people have worked among the various cabinets and understand that, let's just start with the Department of Defense. I talked about bureaucracies before. There are good bureaucracies and bad bureaucracies. There are probably at least nine major bureaucracies inside the Department of Defense. Every one of those has a say in what goes on in the final budget. Okay, you can't work in the Defense Department, in my view, for 10 years and then go over to the State Department and think you understand how the State Department makes decisions. Wrong. You can't go to Commerce. You can't go to Interior. Everybody has their own bureaucracy. And so again, maybe it's time to rethink the cabinet go back to the time when the cabinet was actually a decision-making body and they checked all their biases and prejudices and all their notions of what they wanted for their own particular bureau at the door and actually talked about the national security of this country. You get back to that, I'm probably good with it. It is an interesting question because it is very important in my mind for preservation of whatever that dream of America is that we all have. But it's not clear to me who is in charge. And I don't know. Go ahead, Melissa.
No, you're so right. I also think we had this divorce between domestic policy and national security. You know, we got rid of the draft, we stopped doing war taxes. We had these blunt instruments that allowed citizens to feel and be participating in these big national security decisions that were being made. We cleaved all of that. And now we've essentially given the most powerful roles in the US government to international affairs and national security. The domestic voice of America has much less say and much less sway in the NSC and in what happens, what decisions are made, than our international and military engagements. And so until we sort of shift the view where national security serves the domestic reality and not domestic reality is just a sideshow for politics on the international stage, we have a real challenge. And we did used to have those feedback loops that are now gone. And this is about more than economics, right? Can you imagine the Secretary of Labor winning a fight with the Secretary of Defense in the NS? Can you even imagine him being invited to the NSC? Right? I mean, you laugh, but how, why is that funny, right? I mean, the Secretary of the Interior. And so I would just say, if we really care about securing this nation, we've got to get serious about the role of domestic policy in our national security debates. I guarantee you that China cares about what's going on domestically. We may not like how they do it, but they don't ignore it.
Yeah. Hey, Melissa, I wasn't laughing at you. I was laughing because you're exactly right. We have not yet rallied to any type of
we're leaving out,
agreeable viewpoint. Go ahead, Jamie.
No, I'm sorry, Al. We are leaving out the major part of this country, and that's the states. You know, I mean, if we asked the 50 states to write the national security strategy, what do you think it would look like? Would it look like what the President of the United States put out every year? Would it be different? Could they even agree on anything? I mean, you know, so the strategy in one sense, I noticed that, you know, that somebody early on had talked about the founding fathers. I mean, the founding fathers had to put a strategy together for this country. You know, that's fundamentally what the Bill of Rights is about and what the Constitution is about. And it worked for a period of time, and it doesn't necessarily, you know, it still works, I think, in a great majority of the places. But they brought states' rights, they brought their states into the discussion. I don't think that the states even get this discussion. So this whole notion of what the national security strategy is needs to be kind of rethought. And, you know, so I guess the question, going back to the question of where the right place is, I'm going to withdraw my answer of being the National Security Council and say, I don't have a clue.
That's great.
If we keep talking any longer, we might all feel that way about most of the points. I agree. No, I think I was just reminded of Melissa's point, which is that we lost the art of negotiation, and how do you navigate that messiness? So we avoid having conversations where we have bureaucracies having to agree and states weighing in and citizens giving points of view, because it's difficult to navigate those things, and it's easier to create, you know, political strings and then pull those.
So we're down to about 8 minutes. I was worried that we would have find enough interesting things to talk about. We're leaving about 15 really good questions on the table. I want to thank Gary Soika and Bob Hummel. I asked them to do some questions for us. We haven't gotten to any of those. But I am going to pick up on one of Bob's. Gary's are great, but they're more complex, and they would each be an hour answer. Bob asked, when are competitions necessarily win and lose? And when can there be a win-win competition? And that really cuts the fundamental as I started. In America, we always frame things up as we have to be number one, we have to win. Why can't you have a win-win? How do we set that framework? So I will ask that question.
Well, I was just gonna say, I think we have to start finding win-win competitions. And I think it comes back to that idea of defining outcomes differently than just what is the profit for that one company? What is the shareholder value that we're gonna create? And so I think it requires alliances, collaborations, bringing R&D and use cases together. So having bigger, loftier goals that we're trying to achieve, first of all, so that no one company can solve it, and then figuring out how to define these charters that we can bring organizations, businesses, governments together. You know, one example and one of the questions was around the semiconductor supply chain. This is a global supply chain that we can't control ourselves. No one company can control it. The US government and defense is way behind. I think the Defense Department's represents a couple percent of that global market, so it doesn't have that much power. To make one chip, it requires something like 75 trips across the ocean. More than 90% of those chips are made in Asia, and specifically, Xi Jinping has said, we want to control the strings and we're not going to be nice about it. So we all are on the same side in a global alliance and trying to figure out how do we create a safer, more democratic supply chain for semiconductors. If you think about cars and the shortage and what that caused, and that's only 10% of the global supply chain for chips or cars. And think about chips that are in everything else, from your Starbucks barista's coffee maker to the 100 or so chips that are or more that are in your phone. Imagine shortages of all the things that help us live and work. And so I think we have to maybe make these things more obvious to people, that you won't know until you lose it that you were going to lose it, and define these objectives, more secure and democratic supply chains, for example, and then get businesses and governments and local and state to figure out what's your part in this? How can we all create some kind of alliance around what you meant to do? And then you make your profit based on what your one little part in that global thing is. Otherwise, you won't have a company, because China will take over Taiwan and TSMC will be owned by China, and they'll decide everything about who gets what things. And then nobody wins. You know, so it's sort of that game theory thinking about co-opetition, right? When it makes the most sense we're getting to that point when it's going to make more sense to have to cooperate, to have a win-win competition, or we'll just all lose. And we're hoping to not let it get that far before that happens.
Thank you. Jamie or Melissa?
I think I would also just say it's this idea of the overarching goal that we're just so bad at, right? I never hear people say, like, what would America look like if we won? Like, how would I know we won, right? Because if we're going to call it a competition, that suggests that there's like a finish line, right? That there's some way to win. So the first thing we need to decide is, like, what does winning look like for us? And we need to define that out. It doesn't need to be defined by our competitor losing. It needs to be defined by us accomplishing or achieving something. And if we can clearly articulate that, I think there are ways to bring a lot of partners on board using mechanisms that are perfectly okay with suspicion existing. Every alliance doesn't require trust. It requires transparency, really good structures, clarity in how you go back and dispute something, right? Basic good governance. It doesn't require trust, right? It requires a trust in the system, maybe, and in the governance and the structure that you lay out. But there are ways, say we care about the oceans, then we all have access to what's pinging off the buoys. We don't just let one country put their buoys in and transmit a little bit of data. Everybody gets a sensor in the buoy. It means we're going to have to allow for a lot more transparency in the world in order to accomplish an outcome. I think we have to release this idea that dominance is more important than the actual taking care of our country and having a really well articulated goal. So in my mind, the biggest thing that the US government lacks, and this just goes back to something I think we've said many times, is fundamentally knowing what we want out of this competition. Until we know what we want, we're going to lose it, because we're just going to define it like we're losing it so that we can give more money to DOD.
I would just say, I think one thing winning looks like is that there are things you can continue to count on, and maybe defining what are those things we want to be able to count on. What are those freedoms? What is our access to technology? You know, what are those things that we want to make sure that we still are able to, yeah.
I've got a simple answer, I think. Until we define, and I know people are going to say this is a cop-out, but until we define what the goals and objectives are, you can't define what winning or losing even means, or even breaking even. I mean, you know, I think that the last time that somebody did it right, or I'm not saying it was that I agreed with it necessarily, but Ronald Reagan, who said, you know, it's pretty simple. We win, they lose. Well, guess what? We won, they lost. You know, so he had set out the national objectives, and it worked. But so anyway, until we see what the goals and objectives for for this country going forward, and we understand, and we've got to understand what the rest of the world is doing, how it's reconfiguring, what the other people are going to think about this. I mean, I talk about sometimes about the fact that right now it's all about China. Everything's about China. You can't open the newspaper without seeing China and COVID. In fact, you can't get an article published anywhere, even in Mad Magazine, unless you have China and COVID in there. I mean, you know, that's so. But the point is that in 2050, China may or may not be a big power. But I'm telling you, ASEAN is going to grow up really quickly, and India might actually figure itself out. In which case, you know, gets back to all these great powers and what does power really mean? So bottom line is that I would really encourage Potomac to continue this and to set up a series of these meetings without me and Melissa and Laurie. I mean, I'm happy to join anyway, but get other people involved in the conversation and turn this into a longer term project.
And broader. And I'm going to say that one of the notes here in win-lose is we have to ask the question, what is good enough? And we're not good at asking that question either. But I see that we're at the end of the time period. I would like to thank all three of you and then all the participants on the webinar. This has been a very, very, I think, great discussion. A lot of issues that I can't begin to answer. And I think I'd like to turn it over. Any closing comments as the chair, General Gray?
No, I agree. It's been a fascinating set of discussions here. Obviously, we want to do this again very soon, because we haven't gotten really down to being able to name most of the values and stuff like that we consider both for our great country and internationally in life. And I mean, things like opportunity, family, all those kinds of ideas, they're all part of the value prospect in our great nation and the free world as we know it. Again, Al, for you, another superb record. Thank you all very much for doing it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. One just last comment. You guys teed it up great. For next month, we're looking actually, Lori, you hit it right on the head there. We're looking at supply chains and microelectronics industry and how we could be more globally competitive and what the role of the government should be to that end. So this is one more step in a series of discussions that we plan on having over the next several months. So thank you so much again for joining us today.